Hi, Becca.
Hi, Sean.
So good to be with you today. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Absolutely. I'm delighted to have this conversation.
Yeah, and I know that the students, I'm sure they wish they were in my seat and they could ask you the many questions that I'm sure they have, but hopefully some of the ones that I have and what we'll talk about today will cover some of what is in their minds if they had the chance to be with you. So the first thing I wanted to ask you is um, the term archetypal cosmology, sort of a two-part question. Archetypal cosmology is both, it overlaps with, but it's not the same as archetypal astrology.
Hmm.
So maybe if we could just clear up that for a second. But then I'd like to ask you, why archetypal cosmology in terms of your own life, and maybe, why do you feel it's important for our communities, or for where our communities find ourselves in the world today?
Hmm. I love this set of questions. And in terms of archetypal cosmology, it's it's a larger discipline than the practice of archetypal astrology. So archetypal astrology it's really the study of planetary alignments as they correlate with the unfolding of human events, whether that's in an individual's biography or eras in history and so forth. And so archetypal astrology is what's really looking at that, at the meanings of the planets, the archetypal meanings of the planets, the aspects or the geometrical alignments between them, and then noticing these correlations. Archetypal cosmology is a discipline that encompasses that practice, but is really there to investigate the questions that come up when we notice these correlations.
Hmm.
It's one thing to notice the correlations and say, well, how interesting that when, say, Uranus and Pluto come into alignment, we see that correlate with major revolutionary periods in history. Or when Saturn and Pluto come into alignment, we tend to see that correlate with major contractions and crises in history.
Hmm.
And um, so it's one thing to see the correlations. It's another thing to then speculate and philosophize about, well, what does that mean
Hmm.
about our cosmos? What does that actually indicate? And so that's why archetypal cosmology as a discipline really brings in those philosophical,
Hmm.
um, also psychological, and I would even say spiritual threads of answering that question.
Hmm.
So a part of archetypal cosmology is engaging with the metaphysics of an archetypal cosmos. There's the psychological component of understanding how archetypes work within human beings, within the human psyche, within the collective unconscious. And and then, one area that I find quite interesting, what are the spiritual implications
Hmm.
of that too? And so that's something that the astrology in itself doesn't answer alone. And that's also a topic or a range of topics that not all astrologers take up. And I
Hmm.
think that's something that's really, if not unique to archetypal cosmology, it's far more at the forefront of that discipline than
Hmm.
it is in other branches of astrology.
Hmm.
Um, does that make sense?
Oh, totally. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and it actually leads really nicely into something else that I was wondering that I would love to hear your thoughts on when we're reflecting on the psychological, philosophical, spiritual meaning or implications of these correlations. Um, Obviously, one of the key concepts, if not the key concept in archetypal cosmology, is archetype, the
Mm.
theory of archetypes, which mostly associated with Jung, but as you know, but for those who may not know, has a very long lineage going through Kant and all the way back to certainly Plato, and
Hmm.
maybe even beyond to Homer and the gods and the goddesses and so on. So what I'm wondering is, if we look at archetypal astrology and the transits, we're dealing with, in a sense, geometrical relationships or alignments.
Hmm.
And this harkens back to the Platonic preoccupation with sacred geometry and the harmony of the spheres, the music of the spheres, and so on. And in that sense, we can think of the archetypes as relating pretty closely to Platonic forms. And Jung will speak of the archetypes as a priori formal, structures or dominance of the collective unconscious and so on. So there's that formal, almost geometrical side of the Platonic lineage, but there's also the other side that we see perhaps more in somebody like James Hillman, who speaks of the archetypes in terms of gods and goddesses. So a more personal, personalistic or personified sense of archetypes. So I'm wondering now how this sits with you. How do you make sense of and relate to what might seem like a kind of contradiction or polarity between an abstract, geometrical, formal sense of archetypes on the one hand, and on the other, as mythopoeic, personal gods and goddesses on the other?
Mm. What I have found, both kind of conceptually engaging with it, but also really when it comes to observing the correlations and just the extraordinary spectrum of ways that they can come through in our lives, it's almost like every theory of archetypes in some form or another, whether that's brought forward by Plato with the Platonic forms or ideas, or for Aristotle with the universals, which are more immanent, for Jung where they're very psychological, for Hillman where he's kind of, it's simultaneously interior psychological, and it's like he's bridged back to the mythic deities, the gods and goddesses that, as you were saying, are pre-existing the Platonic kind of philosophical notion of what they are. So Hillman kind of loops all the way back around. I think they're all relevant. It's almost like we need to draw on every theory of archetypes available to us in order to really get all the facets of the kind of planetary archetypes that we see in astrology. Because the planetary archetypes they're complex. They're We can kind of differentiate them from, like with Jung, the psychological archetypes, we often encounter them as figures, or at least that's how they're most popularly known. The great mother, the hero, the wise old man, the divine child, the anima. Like those are personifications,
Mm.
archetypal figures. And of course, Jung is kind of speaking to an archetypal potential that stands behind those figures. But when we encounter them first as those personified forms, that's one expression that we can understand. But then when we encounter an archetypal correlation, for example, that's unfolding in the world around us, and in events, for example, it may be less personal. It may be more something that we recognize, like an immanent Aristotelian universal, something that really feels of the world, but it's being called forward. And in both the Hillmanian deity sense and the Platonic sense, there's something as well that seems to be very transcendent about the planetary archetypes in an abstract way, and in a well, I guess gods and goddesses are personified too, but maybe in a different way than Jung, at least early Jung, originally meant it, as like the gods within versus the gods without.
Mm.
So basically everything I've been saying, I feel like all of that can describe planetary archetypes, and it's
Mhm.
helpful not to rely just on one thinker or one school of thought when it comes to understanding them. It's actually, I think, quite helpful to throw the doors open and look very broadly, because that better helps us to understand um, just the complexity that we see in the multivalence of the
Mm.
planetary archetypes. They're not just figures. They're not to reduce gods and goddesses. They're not just gods. They're also these more abstract forms. They're also transcendent. They're also immanent. I see them as both like kind of being dipolar, drawing
Mm.
on Alfred North Whitehead, where his idea of God, that God is dipolar, has like an eternal pole and an evolving pole. Archetypes seem that way to me as well, where um, there's the part of them that's transcendent in that Whiteheadian or Platonic way that is just beyond this world. But then there's this evolving pole that is what we're seeing around us, and why there are constantly new manifestations of the same archetypes. Um,
Mm. Yes.
so I think they're all relevant, and it's like you need the whole history of philosophy there to
Mhm.
really help support an understanding of what the planetary archetypes are.
Mm.
Um,
I like that.
yeah.
Um, yeah, so I mean I can easily relate to that from a kind of transdisciplinary point of view, or or the intuition and concept of complexity that we're dealing with a complex multidimensional, multivalent reality. So we need to bring to bear a sufficiently complex epistemological orientation or stance, which maybe we can characterize in terms of polarities, transcendent, immanent, sort of abstract, formal,
Hmm.
more embodied, concrete, or sensual, aesthetic on the other, and so on. Um, I'm trying to think of what the way that you relate to the archetypes in this complex multidimensional way, how similar and different that might be from somebody in Renaissance Florence, for instance, who like somebody like Ficino or
Mm.
Pico della Mirandola, who were clearly had a complete grasp of the Platonic sacred geometrical insight on the one hand, and yet also seem to have related to the archetypes as gods and goddesses.
Mm.
Um, were they acting, do you think, just as if, or just sort of playing, or were they able to exist in two modes at once, where they almost like a left brain and right brain, where one is more formal Platonic and the other is
Hmm.
dealing with actual entities who have a name and who are thous and not just its.
Right. Um, my sense is probably it's not just pretending as if, but I like the way you've put that, of kind of shifting between modes of seeing. And it's almost as though um, what the Platonic, more abstract notion allows us to do is pull back some of the veils of how the gods and goddesses would present themselves to us. Um, Going a little bit earlier, for example, to the Neoplatonists, um, they will speak about how with the practice of theurgy,
Mm.
which very much influenced Jung and his practice of active imagination, it's the work of calling the god in.
Mm.
And so it's almost like they're inviting in the more abstract archetypal potential, which Plato is speaking to, into a form, a deified form that is clothed in symbols that
Mm.
we can then understand, we can relate to that better, because it's hard to have a relationship with an abstract principle.
Yeah.
It's you don't quite know what to do with that, and also it's maybe a bit more than our human consciousness can handle in our everyday form. And so that invitation through theurgy, through God work, or for what for Jung became active imagination, is this invitation to come in and dress in symbolic clothing that resembles your abstract archetypal form, but then we can relate to it, and then we can with the Neoplatonists and maybe also with Renaissance magic, make appropriate offerings to gain the favor of those deities or of those beings. And so I think that they can be compatible, but maybe it's like seeing it in layers, that the deity is more of an intermediary between the abstraction and between the human being. So, but yeah, it's interesting to try and bring ourselves through a kind of sympathetic imagination into, how would Ficino be experiencing this, or how would earlier Plotinus be experiencing this? And
yeah, because apparently, I'm sure, I know the painting. I imagine many of our viewers also know Botticelli's is it The Rite of Spring?
The one with the
dance,
three graces, and
the sort of dance in the magical sort of woods or garden.
It's the Primavera.
The Primavera. I thought it was the
Yes.
Rite of Spring. Yeah, the Primavera. So apparently that is a kind of was painted as a kind of magical talisman with attention to the colors and so on, which would have the effect of drawing down Venus or Aphrodite. So drawing down the powers of Aphrodite. So yeah, so there's the imaginal, and I hadn't thought of that connection between Jung's active imagination and the ancient practice of theurgy, which is like which is what, working with the gods in a sensual, aesthetic, and symbolic manner, right? So not just a contemplative manner, but using the senses.
I believe so. I think it depended maybe person to person how they were engaging with it. Some would be in a more meditative, contemplative form. Others more actively bringing in relevant objects that fit in the correspondences. Because what you're speaking to with the Primavera kind of being a talisman of symbols, there are the medieval belief in the correspondences is that various materials of the natural world, stones, plants, animals, metals, they all belong to a different planetary sphere.
Right.
And so that's what alchemists or magicians were working with. And so that's a more kind of tangible, active way of doing that God work. But I think for some it would be more contemplative.
Yeah, so I'm thinking of Agrippa's books on occult philosophy. So I think he was around 1500, a major bridge between ancient philosophy, esoteric lore, and what became later Western esoteric tradition. But in his three books of occult philosophy, there's the terrestrial magic, which includes the four elements, but also the gems, gemstones, and herbs, and all of the life world of the four elements. But then there's the celestial magic, which is the planets, as you said, where the planets correlate with everything here below. But then there's the super celestial realm, which for him was the highest magic, and that involved talismans but primarily with the names of God and the angels and so on.
Mm.
So yeah, already there, I guess, with the Renaissance, and then with Agrippa, the early Renaissance, and the later Renaissance with Agrippa, early modern period, there's this sense of what we are calling the archetypal realm as having these different dimensions, going from the more sort of the mystical name of God through sacred geometry down to planets, and then the four elements with all the gems and so on.
Mm.
So it sounds like you're working with something similar, but now having the passing through the language of
Mm.
depth psychology, process philosophy, and so on.
Yeah. Yeah, actually, just a footnote to what you were saying, there's a new translation that just came out a few months ago of Agrippa's 3 books on occult philosophy.
Oh, really?
It's translated by a scholar named Eric Purdue, and it's the first translation into English for 300 years.
Oh,
And so he went back to the original Latin and he found a lot of errors in the previous translation, kind of assumptions and so forth, that he's corrected. So it's a lot clearer and more just understandable and accessible. So, and it's just beautiful,
wow.
beautiful published edition. So,
Oh, nice.
um,
I look forward to checking that out.
yeah.
Yeah, so
But
this is related to, or this helps me think in a new way, and I want to hear your thoughts on this.
mm,
The question of causality
oh
in
yeah.
archetypal astrology in particular. Um, no, I know that um, that Rick and you and people in the field stress that the archetypes are not they're archetypally predictive, but not literally predictive.
Hmm.
And in terms of causality, there's I think most people have given up any sense that there's any sort of literal physical particles or forces coming from the planets and affecting us that way. So in terms of that kind of material, efficient causality is not there.
Hmm.
But the formal causality is there, and very clearly with the working with quadrature alignments. Um, but I'm wondering about the efficient causality. So in what sense, if we take the the idea that the archetypes are not only formal principles, but are in some sense powers uh, that people used to call gods and goddesses, and some still do. Um, does it make any sense to think that these powers can actually influence in the way that, like in Homer, where Achilles at one point is about to draw his sword in a rage and to kill Agamemnon, I guess it is. And right at that point, Athena appears and grabs his wrist and stops him. So that, we can psychologize that as, a moment of wisdom, of reflection, inhibiting his otherwise very imprudent rage. But on the other hand, maybe it really was a power or a goddess that in some sense gripped his hand. So do you leave any
Yeah.
room in your mind for that kind of efficient causality, not a pseudoscientific rays coming from the planets, but
Yeah.
you see what I mean?
I do. And this brings up an important differentiation that's actually good to talk about for people who are new to looking at astrological correlations is that, like, we've been speaking about archetypes, planetary archetypes, which is the set of meanings associated with the planets. But then there's the physical planets themselves that we're tracking in the sky and seeing the relationships to each other. And so when we're talking about causality and reviving Aristotle's 4 forms of causality, because I think with synchronicity, we suddenly have to pull that back up out of the ancient world, that we can't just do away with formal and final causality. Um, it's, as you were saying, material and efficient causality are not relevant when it comes to the physical planet.
Mm.
the physical planet isn't causing this to happen.
Right.
But then when it comes to, so we could in some way say there is an archetypal cause happening. And so it's formal also in the sense that the archetype literally provides the form of the event that will come through. And with, so I've mostly thought about it as archetypes as formal causes because they give that archetypal form or like the shape to the event that's unfolding or the life that's unfolding. But I hadn't thought about it as efficient causality just because I've always thought about efficient causality in a material sense.
Yeah,
So
me
you're
too.
kind of making me think about it differently, which I like. In terms of that example of Athena stopping Achilles, it's like Mars or Ares is coming in and making him angry, and then Athena comes in as the wisdom to hold him back. Who's ever really to say, is
Yeah.
that the psychological Mars and Athena, and they're just within us, or it's the psychological Mars and Athena in the collective unconscious coming through us as an individual? Or is that any different than what the ancients called Mars and Athena? So
Yeah.
I don't know if we can say, but we have gone through the psychological century. We've made that journey inward. And Rick will sometimes bring up this great question that really stuck with me about 10 years ago more than 10 years ago when I heard it. And he said, well, why did the modern mind disenchant the cosmos? Or why did the cosmos disenchant itself through the modern mind? And it seems that, he has a number of answers that he gives to that. But if the cosmos is disenchanting itself through the modern mind, it's almost as though the modern mind really needed to have that external stimuli cut off. No, you can't blame it on the gods and goddesses that are doing it for you. You have to take some sense of responsibility for those actions. And so it may be Mars and Athena, but you're also an agent here. And in taking responsibility for your agency, which I think is so much of what the psychological turn brings in, that's where it becomes participatory in a new way than like I would posit that ritual and magic, as we've been talking about before, that is a form of participation, but it's still one that gives more of the agency to the gods or to the archetypes. And so in some way, what if every time psychologically we see our Mars or our anger complex getting activated and we're going to yell at that person, and we're like, no, like you're getting triggered. You're having your childhood wounds come up, you rein it back. What if that is a form of ritual, or what if that is a form of prayer, but it's done internally and psychologically instead of with the metals and stones and plants as offerings? It's just interesting to think about.
Yeah, I like that. I like that a lot. Yeah, it's sort of a trying to, I think it's important to keep the developmental perspective in mind, which is in this case, as in most cases, triphasic at a very deep level. We had the original situation of the humans in this field of dynamic field of interaction with gods and goddesses and spirits and so on, and then a disenchantment, internalization. But now we're looking at the possibility of a recovery in some way without being a literal return to that earlier phase, but where we recognize that it's not just a question of human agency or of or of the personal ego. There really are extra egoic powers or forces that we're in relationship with, and we can cultivate a skillful and fruitful relationship with these forces.
Yeah.
That's what I'm hearing from you. I like that.
That, yeah, that's very much what I'm trying to say. So, and I am getting the images from your book Coming Home of the, the triphasic, and um, seeing the evolution that we have been on in relationship, in this case, to these archetypal principles.
Mm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
and that shifting of agency. A metaphor that I often like to draw on is that we're learning how to dance with them as
Mm-hmm.
dance partners, rather, we can be puppets on a string, but to learn how to dance with them, neither partner is necessarily fully in charge or leading. And sometimes we lose our agency and get possessed by the complex, or feel ourselves part of just being caught in larger forces beyond us. um, but feeling that kind of, you take a step forward and I take a step back, and then I'll take a step forward, and you really being in that kind of engaged relationship with these archetypes.
Mm-hmm.
So that's really where I think it's so exciting to think about.
So true. Well, since you mentioned coming home, you probably recall in the appendix to that, I raised the what to me was initially a real sort of conceptual problem, and it's still not resolved, but I'm growing in my relationship to understanding it, and but in that appendix, I raised this apparent tension between the perspective of archetypal astrology, which is cyclical. I mean, even with the outer planets, I mean, the largest cycle we're dealing with is what, 250 years, about the orbit of Pluto.
Yeah, 248 years. So the largest cycle between two planets is the Neptune-Pluto cycle, which they make a conjunction every 500 years. So in
Every
some ways,
500.
that's the largest framework we're working in.
Okay, 500.
Yeah.
I mean, unless we're dealing with something specific like the triple conjunction, right? Which last time was like 2,500 years ago, and the next one is 1,500 years from now, or something like that, or is it?
That sounds about right.
So
It's far away.
Yeah, so that's remarkable. But in terms, at least, of the cycles of the outer planets, if we're dealing with any two planets,
Mhm.
yeah, so the Pluto Neptune is a 500-year cycle. If we're dealing with the ones that are often invoked, at least in Cosmos and Psyche, in terms of Pluto Saturn or Uranus Pluto,
Mhm.
and especially if we're dealing with the quadrature alignments, then we're dealing with pulses every 30 to 50 years, right? Pretty much.
Yeah, it's that with the Uranus Pluto cycle, that's about how far apart they're spaced with the quadrature alignments.
Uh-huh.
Hmm.
So if we imagine these very regularly spaced pulses, and we contrast that with the acceleration of time that we've experienced here on Earth, particularly over the last 500 years, and especially since 1945 with the so-called Great Acceleration,
Hmm.
where we seem to be hurtling towards some kind of singularity, whether it's mass extinction, civilizational collapse, or the rapture, who knows, or Kurzweil's technological singularity, we don't know, but we're definitely hurtling towards something which has never come before in the human historical record. How do you square that acceleration, or square, or do you have a sense of how to relate that acceleration and the singular character of our moment with the regularly spaced cyclical character of archetypal astrology?
Mm. Well, it's, an image that's coming to mind is beautifully illustrated in the documentary series Changing of the Gods,
Mm,
um, made by Kenny Ostubel. It focuses on the Uranus-Pluto cycle from Rick's Cosmos and Psyche, and several couple PCC students or alumni had a hand in making it. And
yeah.
there's an image, more than a hand. There's a beautiful image that's used in several of the episodes of the sun moving through the galaxy
Yeah, I love that.
and then the planets spiraling around it. And so
Yeah.
what you see in visually, instead of a fixed sun with planets cycling around it, you see a whole moving system. And I think that speaks to what you're asking about, where yes, we have these cycles and returns, but the whole thing is on a larger evolutionary trajectory. And
Hmm.
even though each one of the individual pairs of planets, they come in fairly regular cycles. Um, ones with Saturn are quite consistent. Ones with Pluto less consistent because of Pluto's eccentric orbit.
Mm.
And but for the most part, it's quite regular, as you're saying. But each one of those pairs is part of a much larger um, set of unfolding transits that does form unique configurations
Mm.
through time.
Mm.
So what Cosmos and Psyche does is it makes these cycles accessible to us by saying we're just going to, Rick just focuses on Uranus, Pluto, and then he just focuses on Saturn, Pluto, and Jupiter, Uranus, and Uranus, Neptune. But what's really happening, for example, the last several years, we had a long Uranus Pluto square, but in the middle of that, there was a Saturn Uranus Pluto T square, and then a Saturn Neptune square, and then a Jupiter Uranus Pluto T square. And then the whole thing crashed in 2020 into a Saturn Pluto conjunction with Jupiter. Like that
Mm.
configuration of Jupiter, Saturn, Pluto, square Uranus activated by Mars hasn't quite been like that. And so you see a unique set of events
Mm.
like the COVID-19 pandemic, but it all carries echoes of each of those pairs from
Mm.
other times in the cycle, but it combines it in a new way. And we're responding in a different way to it
Mm.
because we, the human species and the Earth community, are on our own evolutionary trajectory in interaction with these cycles.
Mm.
Um, that's why, when you look at a birth chart, it's utterly unique to that individual and it's full of patterns that we've seen all over the place. So that's why you can accurately read a birth chart because you've seen countless examples of Venus, Saturn, or Moon, Pluto, and can draw on all of that to describe your experience might be like this, but that particular set of combinations is unique to that individual.
Mm.
And their own soul has a different karmic expression of it than even someone born at the same time in the same hospital or something. Um, so it's like I think it's like this cyclical archetypal patterning is interacting with something that's going along maybe more of a linear evolutionary trajectory. So I
Mm-hmm.
think it's well illustrated by that image of the sun moving through the galaxy and
Yeah, I love that
planets
image.
spiraling to keep up.
Yeah, I love your explanation there. Yeah, certainly. Yeah, certainly. Once we, well, it would be interesting to know though whether even if we take all of the 10 planets into consideration over a certain period of time, how often, when does the pattern, when does the sequence of transits and aspects, does it ever repeat? And that's what I'd love to know. It's
Yeah.
it's a lot of factors to consider there. I don't know if anybody's ever done that or asked that question.
Yeah, I'm
Uh,
sure someone's asked the question. You'd probably have to have some kind of extraordinary model to
yeah.
figure it out. I'll look at it sometimes in terms of outer planets where there's a mirroring, for example. So um, in the 1920s into the 1930s, we had a Uranus-Pluto trine that moved into a square, right? Because that's just kind of moving along um, their whole cycle where it goes, conjunction, sextile, square, trine. So it moved from the trine to the square from the 20s to the 30s.
Hmm.
Um, and then that alignment, that decade ended in a Saturn-Pluto alignment, which correlated with the Second World War. Um, what we're seeing now is an inverse where we're moving from a Uranus-Pluto square to the trine because it's the other side of the cycle. But there was a Saturn-Pluto alignment in between. So it's like
Uh-huh.
we have to look to different pieces of history to see, well, what happened when it moved from here to here, and this was in between versus this was at the end. And
Right.
um so that's where I think that phrase, like, history doesn't repeat itself but it rhymes, like we are
Mhm.
looking for the rhymes, but some divine poet is up there rearranging the lines all the time too.
Mm, that makes sense. And certainly if we picture the sun with its heliosphere and the planet spiraling in its wake, traveling through the galaxy, doing its orbit around the supermassive black hole at the center of our galaxy, that takes roughly, that's like one Platonic year, right? It takes roughly what, 24,000 something years, I think, something like that.
I mean,
uh
isn't that interesting to think about, that the Earth's wobble, the
mhm,
26,000-year cycle of the precession of the equinoxes,
yeah,
which is another huge cycle, and then the sun moving through the galaxy, they're not terribly off in their numbers.
yeah, you're right. Actually, I had previously just assumed they were the same thing, but yeah, maybe they're not the same thing. And if they're not the same thing but they actually correspond, that is pretty remarkable. That's a note to self: figure out the relationship between precession and because I always thought the Platonic year was due to precession.
That's how I've
It
always referred to it.
Yeah, it is. But maybe I'm remembering incorrectly that it takes roughly the same amount of time for uh, the solar system to
I've heard that too. So
make around.
we're either both making the same mistake or yeah, I'm missing my high school astronomy class right
Okay,
now.
I'll have to look into that because that's I think that could be significant. Well, this is a particular rabbit hole I would love to go down, but time is running short. So I have two more
Sure.
questions I want to ask you before we conclude.
Yeah.
Knowing your passion and gifts in the realms of the arts and literature, I'm wondering if you could just say a few words about how archetypal cosmology enters into your relationship with literature and the arts,
Mm.
just in general, not, yeah,
Yeah.
or a taste. Hmm.
It's it seems that the arts are a wonderful way to embody or to access the archetypes more directly. It's
Mm.
like whether it's through film and performance or music or painting, or written literature, poetry, that can get a little closer to that, like the unveiled form.
Mm.
Um, and so it's what we can see is a like a direct access to the archetypes coming through artists, and um, making their art more than human. Like, we talk about like actors or artists being larger than life, because in some sense they're embodying the archetypal. So I find that the astrological perspective simply makes the enjoyment of art so much the greater,
Mm.
because if we look at say an artist's birth chart and see how what is in their birth chart is expressed in what they're creating, it teaches us about that individual. It teaches us about that archetypal complex that's coming through in ways that we don't see as clearly in the mundane day-to-day factors of individual lives or our own life. So I think the arts are a great way to teach archetypal astrology. Because of that, it's like you get to tap in a little bit more directly to the archetypal principles and see them honored and expressed really fully. So I can't watch a movie or listen to music or anything without needing to know what the astrological correlations are behind it. My favorite game is to guess beforehand what it might be.
Well, so this is bridging back to our earlier discussion about Renaissance magic and theurgy and so on. And yeah, that makes sense. And it's you've actually, I think, already answered, or certainly begun to answer, what was to be my last question. And that was, do you have any tips for recommendations for our students in terms of what might be helpful in cultivating one's archetypal eye, cultivating the archetypal eye or ear in this case, if you're listening to music?
Yeah, the archetypal eye, the archetypal ear, all of our senses really get drawn in, and the imagination gets drawn in to perceiving archetypes. It's teaching how to cultivate the archetypal eye is one of the most fascinating things, because it's almost, if you can see the world through that lens, it's almost like you have to work backwards. Wait, how did I get there? And as we were just talking about, I think the arts is a really great example, because people can see and feel and hear the archetypal presence in a way that circumvents the mind. Like music, for example, we feel that emotionally and in our bodies, as well as, intellectually understanding lyrics or visually interpreting images. It touches all the levels of our being. So the arts, I think, are a very profound way to cultivate the archetypal eye, and then working with a whole variety of forms of expanded or non-ordinary states of consciousness, which is what we talk about in the Psyche and Cosmos courses. And that can be through a variety of means. We were speaking before about active imagination, which is a very profound way that Jung himself used to connect in directly with archetypal perception. Stan Grof's holotropic breathwork as well is a really powerful modality to be able to perceive the archetypes in their fullness. And it seems that when we can engage with them in that expanded way through active imagination or holotropic breathwork, or responsibly held sacred medicine experiences, when we experience it in that expanded state, when we come back to our ordinary state of consciousness, we can actually more easily discern or recognize those archetypes in the world around us. It's like we're recognizing an old friend that we encountered in this other state of consciousness, that now we see, oh, there you are, in that particular mundane everyday example. So it's almost like using the archetypal imagination as an inhale and an exhale. So you inhale by expanding out through meditation, through the arts, through holotropic states. You inhale the archetypal, and then you exhale by observing it in the world. So I think those are some modalities that can be really helpful in cultivating it over time. It takes.
That's great. Well, this time with you today has been like such a deep breath, like walking in a lovely mountain meadow and breathing in very invigorating air, and it's opened, it's stimulated my archetypal eye and imagination. So, and I'm sure that's true for all of our students.
Mm.
Thank you
Well,
so
thank
much,
you.
Becca, for
Mm.
doing this today. And
Such a pleasure. Thank you so much, Sean. It's great to just have the time to talk with you about these ideas and really practice the philosophical and psychological and spiritual components of archetypal cosmology. I feel like that's what we were doing in this conversation.
yes, me too. And I really look forward to our next conversation.
Likewise.
Okay, you take care.
You too.